when they were just 17 years of age.
Terrible.
And no one should be under any illusion that these victims got a fair hearing, proper due process, or a chance to appeal. No wonder that people in Iran are angry and outraged about this barbarity. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, it is not hard to understand the underlying reasons for this barbarity. The reality is that we have a theocratic regime with a non-existent domestic support enforcing its medieval ideology on a young population and desire for freedom and democratic future for their country. That is why, ladies and gentlemen, for almost 4 decades, this regime is still waging a total war against its own people and has carried out over 2,000 executions during the 2 years of its so-called moderate President Hassan Rouhani. The problem is not complicated. Indeed, executions and repressions are the very means by which the mullahs preserve their medieval regime, ensuring that the supreme leader's power remains absolute. Regretfully, ladies and gentlemen, we in the West and other democratic countries have allowed the regime to get away with all of its crimes for far too long. As a result, the regime has expanded its killings to abroad, targeting dissidents, including Camp Liberty, or threatening our free societies with terror attacks and bombings by its affiliates. The direct consequence of our silence is the Iranian regime's active military participation in support of Assad's regime's massacre in Syria and Tehran's continuous support for terrorist proxies in Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, Bahrain, and the other parts of the region. Ladies and gentlemen, if Western governments have stood up to the systematic and ongoing abuse of human rights in Iran, demanding accountability for those responsible for the execution of 120,000 political dissidents and supporters of Iran's democratic opposition, the NCRI, the PMOI, or the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in 1988, the theocratic regime could have never expanded their barbarity in Syria and the crisis that we're all seeing on our television sets today. Ladies and gentlemen, Iran has been and remains to be the source of instability in the region. There can be absolutely no doubt of that. Any other conclusion is just wishful thinking. This situation can only be addressed properly if our government and our Western allies change their misguided approach towards Tehran and abandon their pursuit of a conciliatory policy towards Iran, hoping that will encourage the theocratic regime to change its unacceptable behaviour voluntarily. We need to back up words with concrete actions. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, our committee has put forward a series of policy recommendations in a statement to the government to review its policy on Iran, recommending the following. First, we must make it clear to rulers of Iran that their behaviour towards their own people is totally unacceptable. We must not turn a blind eye to the great violation of human rights in Iran. The human rights situation in Iran must be a priority in any bilateral relationship. Secondly, we need to encourage with Iran's democratic opposition the National Council of Resistance of Iran and support the 10-point platform of the NCRI President-elect Mrs. Mariam Rajavi, which commits to the abolition of the death penalty, ending the use of torture in future Iran, and calls for a democratic, non-nuclear Iran with separation of religion and state, gender equality, and elimination of all religious and ethnic discrimination. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad to announce that over 200 of my colleagues from both Houses of Parliament, and it's very good to see some of them here today, and from all major parties, have declared their support for these policy recommendations, and hopefully we can increase the number further in the near future. Our message to the government is clear. We can no longer afford to ignore the democratic aspirations and desire of Iranian people for change. We can no longer dismiss their legitimate resistance to the theocracy in Tehran. For the sake of this nation, the world and our future interests, we should not legitimise a horrible theocracy by shaking hands with its representatives. Instead, we must now stand with those seeking a free and democratic Iran, which is guaranteed in the 10-point plan of Mrs. Mariam Rajavi, and demand accountability for those responsible, including senior regime officials and the Supreme Leader. Now, before I read out the message from Mrs. Rajavi, I do hope that in the not too distant future we can stop this ridiculous situation where Mrs. Rajavi cannot talk to you in person. And for that reason, I and my parliamentary colleagues are having constructive talks with one of the Foreign Office Ministers, Tobias Ellwood, and one of the Home Office Ministers, James Brokenshire. And we are absolutely avowed to find out in real detail why this ban is still holding in its place, whereas other countries has lifted it. So that is my avowed intention with my colleagues, to try and get the ban lifted as soon as possible. Now, this is the message from Mrs. Rajavi. Ladies and gentlemen, greetings to all of you. Your defence of Iran's suppressed human rights is heartwarming to my fellow compatriots. Just last week, they were shocked by the hanging of a 23-year-old woman and a young man, as I've already said, who was only 17 at the time of committing the alleged crime. The regime's daily executions are the dominant element of a campaign which involves the denial of all individual and social freedoms for my compatriots, and the imposition upon them of various forms of punishments and restrictions. For example, 2 poets were sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment for their style of poetry, and a film producer was condemned to 6 years in prison and 240 lashes. Such dreadful incidents and the incessant clampdown of women and youth comprise the most significant aspects of a policy within which bloodletting and destabilisation are inherent. Let us look at Iraq. The Iranian regime and the militia affiliated to the Quds force are the main cause of instability in that country and have been instrumental to the conditions for popular uprisings in Iraq and to confront ISIS. I prefer to call them Daesh, by the way. Let us look at Syria. The main cause of instability is the Iranian regime. It is Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps that fights on the front line of genocidal operations whose victims have exceeded 300,000. Tehran's mullahs directed a devastation nationwide crackdown, bringing about the homelessness of millions of Syrians and mass migration of hundreds of thousands of them to Europe. The Iranian regime also laid the ground for Russia's meddling in Syria and escalation of the crisis there. Let us look at Yemen. The mullahs and their proxy group led the country into war. Now what must be done? In recent months, a weak nuclear agreement has been achieved. Even if the agreement was stronger, it would remain impossible to implement without a firm stance against the mullah's aggression. All the while, Iran has a decline in economy, the lion's share of which is dominated by the religious dictatorship and its revolutionary guard corps. The current recession and bankruptcy have left little room for engagement of European businesses. However, even if deals are agreed, it would be a deal directly with companies belonging to the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which would therefore provide finance for the system of suppression and terror inside Iran and in the region. Finally, and significantly, this is a religious dictatorship incapable of reform. The regime, now led by a so-called moderate president, has carried out the largest number of executions in the past quarter century. However, on the other side of the coin, there is an enthusiastic nation which has an organised and powerful resistance of its own. A people and a resistance that desire lasting democracy with the abolition of the death penalty, separation of religion and state, and equality of men and women. This is the force that holds the key to ending the crisis in Iran and the Middle East. The true and enduring blooming of European countries' relations with Iran is dependent on the path undertaken by this resistance. We have time and again experienced that our policy relying on the Iranian regime, which is the main cause of instability and genocide in the region, is doomed to failure. The right policy is to side with the Iranian people and resistance. I call on Britain and all Western governments to stop ignoring human rights abuses in Iran and predicate their relations with the Iranian regime on the ending of the death penalty. I also call on those governments to fulfill their pledge to protect Iranian dissidents in Camp Liberty, who are the main target of the Iranian regime's killing and suppression. Specifically, the inhumane medical blockade of Camp Liberty, which must be lifted as soon as possible. Camp Liberty's dossier and its management must also be taken out of the hands of agents tied to the clerical regime in Iran. So, my friends, it is wonderful that more than 200 members of the House of Commons and Lords have signed a declaration calling for the adoption of a correct policy on Iran, specifically supporting freedom, mercy and justice and human rights in Iran. I and the people of Iran appreciate their support and endeavours, and I wish your conference every success. So,